Picture this. It is Super Bowl Sunday, 1986. 100 million Americans are gathered around their televisions, and before the first play is called, before the first touchdown is scored, the most watched advertisement in the history of American television airs. 6 magnificent horses, enormous, chest deep in fresh snow, pulling a red and gold wagon through a postcard New England town while a Dalmatian rides shotgun and a crowd of people cheer from the sidewalk. No celebrity, no punchline, no special effects, just the Budweiser Clydesdales. And every American watching knows exactly who sent them. At that moment, Anheuser-Busch was not merely a company, it is an institution, a piece of the American identity as permanent and immovable as the flag itself. Budweiser is the best-selling beer on planet Earth. Anheuser-Busch controls nearly half of all beer sold in the United States. Every 10 seconds, somewhere in America, someone opens a Budweiser. The St. Louis brewery complex, stretching along the Mississippi riverfront, is the largest single brewing operation in the world. The Busch family, now in its 4th generation of American royalty, presides over a fortune worth billions. Estates, racehorses, private lands, a name that carries more weight in Missouri than any politician ever has. The man at the top is August Anheuser-Busch III. Lean, precise, ruthless in the way that only men who have spent their entire lives fighting to prove themselves can be. He did not inherit this empire gracefully. He took it, and under his iron command, Anheuser-Busch has grown into something even its legendary founder could not have fully imagined. The Busch family has survived Prohibition. They have survived the Great Depression. They have survived 2 world wars, the rise of Miller Lite, and every regional brewer that ever dared challenge them. They are, by any measure, the most successful brewing dynasty in the history of the world. A family that turned a German immigrant's modest St. Louis brewery into a global empire worth $15 billion. They are untouchable, permanent, inevitable, except they are not, because what none of those 100 million Super Bowl viewers can see, what the Clydesdales and the snow and the perfectly orchestrated pageantry carefully conceals, is what is already happening inside the family behind the brand. The rage between a father and a son that has never healed. The heir who is drinking himself toward a cliff's edge. The boardroom that is quietly, methodically being prepared for surrender. The lawyers who will one day divide a $15 billion fortune in the most bitter, public, and devastating family civil war in American corporate history. In less than 25 years, this dynasty will be gone. The brewery will be sold to foreigners for $52 billion, the largest consumer goods acquisition in history, while the family that built it stands by, fractured and unable to stop it. The heirs will turn on each other in courtrooms and lawyers' offices across Missouri. A young woman will die. A fortune will be fought over. A name that once meant everything in St. Louis will become synonymous with squandered greatness. And Grant's Farm, the 281-acre estate that Adolphus Busch built as a monument to his dynasty, where the Clydesdales still graze today, will nearly be lost entirely. This is not a story about beer. This is a story about what happens when the hunger for power within a family grows larger than the love that built it. About how dynasties are not destroyed by competitors or recessions or hostile takeovers alone, but from within, quietly, bitterly, one betrayal at a time. This is the tragic fall of the Anheuser-Busch heirs, and it began, as all great American tragedies do, with a man who arrived with nothing. In 1857, a 21-year-old German boy stepped off a steamboat onto the docks of St. Louis, Missouri, with very little money, almost no English, and an ambition that would have seemed delusional to anyone watching him arrive. His name was Adolphus Busch. He was the second youngest of 22 children born to a prosperous merchant family in Castile, Germany, a small town on the Rhine River just across from Mainz. His father dealt in wine and brewing supplies, which meant Adolphus had grown up around the business of fermentation without ever being trained as a brewer himself. He understood commerce, he understood supply chains and customer relationships and the quiet arithmetic of profit and loss. He was, from his earliest years, a businessman in his bones. St. Louis in 1857 was a city in the middle of becoming something extraordinary. Positioned at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, it was the gateway to the American West, a churning, ambitious, immigrant-packed city that smelled of river mud and possibility in equal measure. German immigrants flooded in by the thousands, bringing with them their language, their culture, and most importantly for our story, their centuries-old tradition of brewing beer. Adolphus found work quickly, first as a clerk, then as a wholesale busman supplying local breweries with hops and malt and equipment. It was unglamorous work, but it gave him something more valuable than a salary. It gave him a complete education in every brewery in St. Louis, their strengths, their weaknesses, their owners, and their futures. One of those breweries belonged to a German immigrant named Eberhard Anheuser. Anheuser was a soap manufacturer who had acquired a struggling brewery called Bavarian Brewery in 1860, largely to recover a debt. He knew almost nothing about brewing and even less about running a beer business. The brewery was barely surviving, producing a thin, unreliable product that locals drank mostly because nothing better was available. Then Adolphus Busch met Anheuser's daughter. Her name was Lily. They married in 1861 in a double wedding ceremony alongside Adolphus's brother Ulrich, who married Lily's sister. It was, by any measure, a remarkable consolidation of two German immigrant families, and it gave Adolphus Busch something he had been quietly angling toward since he arrived in St. Louis, a reason and a path to enter the brewery business. He joined the Anheuser Brewery as a salesman, then as a partner. Then, following Eberhard Anheuser's death in 1880 as its sole commanding force, the company was renamed Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association, and under Adolphus it was transformed almost beyond recognition. What Adolphus understood that his competitors did not was breathtakingly simple and almost impossibly difficult to execute. He wanted to make the same beer, tasting exactly the same, available everywhere in America. Not just in St. Louis, not just in Missouri, everywhere. At a time when most beer was local by necessity, brewed close to where it was consumed because it spoiled quickly and transportation was unreliable, Adolphus Busch set out to build the first truly national beer brand in American history. To do it, he needed to solve three problems simultaneously. The first was pasteurization. Adolphus became one of the first American brewers to adopt Louis Pasteur's recently published pasteurization process, using heat to kill the microorganisms that caused beer to spoil. Suddenly, Anheuser-Busch beer could travel. The second was refrigeration. Adolphus built a network of railcar icehouses and pioneered the use of refrigerated railcars to ship beer across the country without it turning. He essentially built a cold chain across America a full generation before refrigeration became standard practice. The third was consistency. He traveled to the Bohemian region of what is now the Czech Republic, studied the great lager brewing traditions of the region, and in 1876 introduced a beer he named after the Bohemian city of Budweiser. He called it Budweiser. It was lighter, crisper, and more consistent than anything American drinkers had tasted before. He marketed it not as a local product but as the king of beers, a beer worthy of any table in any city in any state in the nation. He was right. By 1901, Anheuser-Busch became the first American brewery to sell 1 million barrels of beer in a single year. The immigrant boy from Castell had built something that had never existed before, an American beer empire, a national brand, a dynasty. But Adolphus Busch was not just building a company, he was building a family identity so powerful, so deeply fused with the product itself, that one day it would become impossible to tell where the beer ended and the Busch family began. That fusion would be their greatest strength, and ultimately their most devastating weakness. Adolphus Busch died in 1913 on his estate in Germany, surrounded by the kind of wealth and recognition that most men spend entire lifetimes chasing and never find. He left behind a brewery that produced more beer than any other in the world, a family name that had become synonymous with American ambition, and a dynasty he fully expected to endure for generations. He was not wrong about the dynasty. For a time, it was everything he had imagined. The Busch family in its golden years was not merely wealthy, it was mythological. St. Louis did not just admire the Bushes, it organized itself around them. The family gave the city its identity the way the Rockefellers gave New York its skyline and the Fords gave Detroit its purpose. To be a Busch in St. Louis was to occupy a category entirely your own. Above politics, above society, above the ordinary architecture of the American class, the physical expression of this mythology was Grant's farm. Adolphus had purchased the 281-acre property on the outskirts of St. Louis in 1903, partly because it sat on land once farmed by Ulysses S. Grant himself, and partly because a man who had built what Adolphus had built needed a monument to match. He constructed a grand Jacobean-style mansion he called the Bauernhof, German for farmyard, surrounded by stone gatehouses, game preserves, exotic animals, and manicured grounds that announced, in the most unambiguous possible terms, that the Busch family had arrived. It was on these grounds that the dynasty's most iconic symbol was born. In 1933, the day after Prohibition was repealed, August Busch Sr. presented his father, August Sr., with a gift to celebrate the return of legal beer, a team of 6 magnificent Clydesdale horses hitched to a gleaming red and gold brewery wagon. The elder Busch reportedly wept. The Clydesdales were driven through the streets of St. Louis that same day, then sent to deliver the first post-Prohibition case of Budweiser to the White House in Washington. America fell in love with them instantly, and the Clydesdales became something no marketing department could have manufactured deliberately, a genuine symbol, not just of Budweiser, but of a particular idea of America: strength, tradition, beauty, reliability. Every year at the Super Bowl, every appearance at a county fair, every slow canter down a Main Street parade route reinforced the same message. The Busch family was not just selling beer. They were selling a version of America back to Americans, and Americans could not get enough of it. The man who most completely embodied this mythology was August Anheuser-Busch Sr., known to everyone in St. Louis simply as Goosey. Goosey Busch was one of the great American originals. Large in every sense, physically imposing, thunderously loud, extravagantly generous, and possessed of a personality that seemed to fill whatever room, stadium, or river barge he happened to occupy. He wore his wealth the way a man wears a favorite coat, comfortably, naturally, without apology. He kept exotic animals at Grant's farm, hosted legendary parties, and moved through St. Louis society with the easy authority of a man who understood that he did not need to impress anyone because everyone was already impressed. In 1953, he purchased the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team because Goosey Busch was precisely the kind of man who bought baseball teams. He renamed their stadium Busch Stadium, a move so audaciously self-promotional that the city loved him more for it rather than less. Under his ownership, the Cardinals won 3 World Series championships. St. Louis adored him, and Anheuser-Busch under Goosey's stewardship grew into something even Adolphus could not have fully anticipated. By the 1970s, the company controlled more than 40% of the American beer market. Budweiser was not merely the best-selling beer in America, it was the best-selling beer on Earth. The brewery complex along the St. Louis riverfront employed thousands of workers whose families had worked there for generations. The Busch name was carved into the identity of an entire American city. This was the dynasty at its absolute apex, vast, powerful, beloved, and seemingly indestructible. But empires built by extraordinary men carry a particular kind of danger, because the men who inherit them must contend not just with running a company, but with the crushing, suffocating weight of living inside a legend. And for the next generation of Busch heirs, that weight would prove impossible to bear. Every dynasty has a moment, a single defining rupture where the mythology of family unity collides with the reality of human ambition. For the Rockefellers, it came in boardrooms and bitter inheritance disputes. For the Kennedys, it came in tragedy and scandal. For the Busch family, it came on a cool autumn morning in 1975, inside a corporate conference room in St. Louis, when a son looked across a table at his own father and took everything from him. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand the 2 men in that room. Goosey Busch was 76 years old in 1975. He had run Anheuser-Busch for nearly 3 decades. He had bought the Cardinals, built Busch Stadium, expanded the brewery into a global operation, and turned the Clydesdale into the most recognizable symbol in American advertising. He was old world in every meaningful sense, emotional, relationship-driven, loyal to the people around him to a fault, and deeply convinced that running a great company meant more than reading financial reports. It meant knowing your workers by name. It meant shaking hands in the brewery at 6 in the morning. It meant understanding that a brand was not a balance sheet, it was a promise. His son August Anheuser-Busch III was 41 years old and had spent his entire life preparing to take what he believed was rightfully his. Where Goosey was warm, August III was cold. Where Goosey led through personality and relationships, August III led through data, discipline, and an almost surgical ruthlessness that made even his allies uneasy. He had worked his way through every department in the brewery, not out of humility, but out of calculation. He wanted to understand every weakness, every inefficiency, every vulnerability in the operation before he assumed command of it. He had also spent years watching his father make decisions he considered sentimental, wasteful, and dangerously out of step with the modern competitive landscape. Miller Brewing Company, owned by Philip Morris, was pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into marketing. Miller Lite was reshaping the entire beer industry. The competitive threat was real, urgent, and in August III's assessment, being met with entirely insufficient urgency by a man who was more comfortable on a riverboat party than in a strategy session. August III decided it was time. What he orchestrated in 1975 was, by any honest description, a corporate coup. He spent months quietly building alliances on the Anheuser-Busch board of directors, cultivating relationships with members who shared his concern about the company's strategic direction and his belief that new leadership was necessary. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without sentiment in his approach to dismantling his own father's authority. When the board meeting came, Gussie Busch walked in expecting a routine session. What he encountered was a carefully prepared ambush. The board voted to remove him as chief executive. August Anheuser-Busch III was named in his place. Gussie reportedly sat in silence for a long moment after the vote. Then he stood, looked around the room at the men he had known for decades, some of whom he had hired himself, and walked out. He never forgave his son. The personal devastation of what August III had done to his father was immense and lasting. Gussie Busch had poured his life into that company. It was not merely his occupation. It was his identity, his legacy, the vessel into which he had placed everything that mattered to him. To have it taken by his own son, through a calculated boardroom maneuver, was a wound that went far deeper than professional humiliation. Father and son never fully reconciled. The warmth that Goosey had always projected publicly, the big laugh, the generous gesture, the arm around the shoulder, curdled when it came to August III. And August III, for his part, showed no visible remorse. He had done what he believed needed to be done. Sentiment was not part of his operational vocabulary. What the coup revealed, in the starkest possible terms, was the character of the man now in charge of the most powerful brewing dynasty in the world. August Anheuser-Busch III was brilliant, disciplined, and visionary in his understanding of the beer business. He would go on to prove all of that beyond any reasonable doubt, but he had also just demonstrated something else entirely, something that would echo through every relationship he touched for the rest of his life. He was a man who, when power was the prize, was capable of anything, even taking it from his own father. And the son, watching all of this from the edges, young August IV, barely a teenager, absorbing every lesson his father was teaching him without meaning to, would one day discover exactly what that meant. Whatever you think of how August Anheuser-Busch III took power, what he did with it is difficult to argue with. In the 23 years he spent at the helm of Anheuser-Busch, from 1975 to 2002, he transformed the company from a dominant American brewer into something closer to a force of nature. Market share climbed from roughly 40% to nearly 50% of all beer consumed in the United States. Budweiser became not merely the best-selling beer in America, but a global cultural artifact, exported to dozens of countries and consumed on every inhabited continent. The company's revenues grew from approximately $1 billion annually to more than $10 billion. Anheuser-Busch became one of the most profitable consumer goods companies on earth. August III achieved this through a combination of obsessive operational discipline, marketing genius, and a competitive ferocity that bordered on the pathological. He was, by every account of people who worked with him, one of the most demanding bosses in American corporate history. He knew the brewery the way a surgeon knows anatomy, intimately, precisely, without illusion. He could walk the production floor and identify inefficiencies that trained engineers had missed. He reviewed advertising campaigns personally, sometimes rejecting work that entire agencies had spent months producing because a single frame felt wrong to him. His response to the Miller Lite threat was characteristically aggressive. Rather than cede the growing light beer market to Miller, he launched Bud Light in 1982 and backed it with a marketing investment that dwarfed anything the industry had seen. Bud Light did not merely compete with Miller Lite. It eventually destroyed it, going on to become the best-selling beer in America, a position it would hold for decades. He fought distributors, retailers, and competitors with equal intensity, building Anheuser-Busch's distribution network into the most formidable in the industry. He was not above using that network as a weapon, squeezing competitors off shelves, locking up accounts, making life extraordinarily difficult for any brewer with the temerity to challenge Budweiser's dominance. The tactics were aggressive, frequently questioned, occasionally investigated. August III did not particularly care. Results were what mattered, and the results were undeniable. But the human cost of his reign was written on the faces of everyone around him. Executives who displeased him were dismissed without ceremony and often without warning. Loyalty, in August III's operational universe, was a one-way obligation, owed to him completely, returned by him selectively. He surrounded himself with capable people and then created an atmosphere so pressurized, so unforgiving of error, that even his most talented lieutenants operated in a state of permanent anxiety. Former employees describe a culture in which a single meeting with August III could make or break a career, where his approval was desperately sought and his contempt was professionally terminal. His personal relationships bore the same marks. Multiple marriages, a reputation for coldness that followed him through every room he entered. The warmth his father had radiated so naturally, the quality that had made Gussie Busch genuinely beloved in St. Louis, was entirely absent in August III. He was respected, he was feared, he was occasionally admired, he was never by any account loved in the way his father had been. And at home, in the shadow of all this power and discipline and relentless achievement, a boy was growing up who would inherit all of the pressure and none of the psychological armor. August Anheuser-Busch IV watched his father command an empire with the certainty of a man who had never seriously doubted himself. He watched the executives flinch. He watched the competitors retreat. He watched St. Louis organize itself around the Busch name the way it always had, and he understood from the earliest age what was expected of him. He was the fourth, the heir, the continuation of a dynasty that stretched back to a German immigrant on a St. Louis dock in 1857. The weight of that expectation would have been immense for any young man. For August IV, who was already fighting battles inside himself that had nothing to do with beer, it would prove to be something far closer to a death sentence. There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs exclusively to the children of extraordinarily powerful men. It is not the tragedy of poverty or obscurity or failed ambition. It is quieter than that, and in many ways more devastating. It is the tragedy of a person who arrives in the world already defined by a name, by an expectation, by the long shadow of someone whose achievements have become the only standard by which they will ever be measured. August Anheuser-Busch IV was born into that shadow in 1964. And he spent the next 4 decades never fully escaping it. From the outside, his early life looked like privilege in its purest form. Grant's farm, private schools, the automatic social gravity that came with being a Busch in St. Louis. Doors opened before he reached them. Rooms rearranged themselves around his arrival. People who had never met him treated him with a deference that had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with whose son he was. But inside that gilded environment, something was fracturing quietly and early. His relationship with his father was, by every account, profoundly damaging. August 3rd was not a man who softened his standards for anyone, including, especially, his own son. The same merciless precision he applied to brewery operations, to marketing campaigns, to corporate strategy, he applied to August 4th. Nothing the boy did was quite good enough. No achievement landed with sufficient weight. The approval August 4th desperately needed from his father was dispensed, if at all, in quantities too small to satisfy and too irregular to rely on. He turned, as many children of emotionally inaccessible fathers do, toward the things that made the pain quieter: parties, alcohol. The kind of reckless freedom that vast inherited wealth makes is dangerously accessible. By the time he reached young adulthood, August 4th had developed a reputation in St. Louis that existed in uncomfortable parallel to his family name: charming and charismatic on one hand, dangerously excessive on the other. Then, in 1983, when August 4th was 19 years old, everything almost ended before it had properly begun. He was driving near Tucson, Arizona, when his car was involved in an accident. His passenger, a 22-year-old woman named Michelle Frederick, was thrown from the vehicle and killed. August 4th told investigators he was not driving. Witnesses and evidence told a different story. Charges were considered. Then, under circumstances that many observers in Arizona found deeply troubling, the case was dropped. No charges were ever filed. The young woman's family received a settlement. August 4th walked away. It was the first public demonstration of something that would define his story for the rest of his life: the way that the Busch name and the Busch fortune could absorb consequences that would have been terminal for anyone without them. The accident did not end his ascent within Anheuser-Busch. It barely interrupted it. August 3rd, whatever his private feelings about the incident, continued grooming his son for eventual leadership. The dynasty required an heir, and August 4th was what was available. He worked his way through the company as his father had done before him, learning the brewery floor, the marketing operation, the distribution network. He was, when he applied himself, genuinely capable. People who worked with him describe a man of real intelligence and charm, someone who could walk into a room full of strangers and make every person in it feel personally seen. He had his grandfather Gussie's gift for human connection, the warmth, the humor, the easy magnetism that made people want to be around him. But the drinking never stopped, the recklessness never fully retreated, and the psychological wound at the center of his relationship with his father never healed. In 2002, when August 3rd stepped back from day-to-day operations, the succession process that followed was, like everything in this family, more complicated and more painful than it appeared from the outside. August 4th was not immediately handed the keys. There were other executives, other candidates, other opinions about whether the heir was ready or whether he would ever be ready. The debate within the company was real and serious, but in 2006, August Anheuser-Busch IV was named Chief Executive Officer of Anheuser-Busch Companies. The fourth generation of the dynasty had taken command. St. Louis celebrated. The name continued. The legend appeared intact. What almost nobody outside the innermost circle of the company understood was that August 4th had taken the helm of a $15 billion empire at precisely the moment when the most dangerous storm in the company's entire history was forming on the horizon, and he would not have the strength or the support to weather it. In the spring of 2008, a letter arrived at Anheuser-Busch headquarters in St. Louis that changed everything. It came from InBev, a Belgian-Brazilian brewing conglomerate assembled over the previous decade through a series of aggressive acquisitions that had made it the largest brewing company in the world by volume. InBev's chief executive was a Brazilian named Carlos Brito, lean, analytical, fluent in the cold language of shareholder value and operational efficiency. He had built his career dismantling inefficiencies and extracting maximum returns from the companies InBev consumed. He was, in temperament and methodology, almost eerily similar to August 3rd. The letter contained a takeover bid, $65 per share, a total transaction value of approximately $46 billion. August 4th read it and felt, by his own later account, something close to physical nausea. This was not a business proposition. This was an assault on everything his family had built across 5 generations. The brewery that Adolphus had constructed from nothing in 1857. The Clydesdales that had made 100 million Americans feel something real on a Super Bowl Sunday. Grant's Farm. The St. Louis riverfront. The name on the stadium. All of it potentially about to pass into the hands of a corporation headquartered in Leuven, Belgium, run by men who had never set foot in Missouri and whose primary interest in Budweiser was the margin it could generate for their shareholders. August IV rejected the offer immediately and publicly. He called it wholly inadequate. He assembled a defense team of lawyers and investment bankers and announced that Anheuser-Busch was not for sale. St. Louis rallied around him. Local politicians gave speeches. Workers at the brewery signed petitions. The city understood instinctively what was at stake, and the resistance felt for a brief moment like it might actually hold. But InBev had done its homework. The uncomfortable truth that August IV's defense team confronted almost immediately was that Anheuser-Busch's financial performance under his leadership had been, by the standards Wall Street applied to publicly traded companies, disappointing. Costs were higher than they should have been. Growth had slowed. The stock price had underperformed competitors for years. Institutional shareholders, the pension funds and investment managers who between them owned enormous blocks of Anheuser-Busch stock, were not sentimental about St. Louis heritage or Clydesdale commercials. They were interested in return on investment, and InBev was offering them a substantial premium on a stock that had been going nowhere. The board of directors, bound by their fiduciary obligations to shareholders, began listening. And then there was Auguste Thurtain, the man who had staged a boardroom coup against his own father 33 years earlier, the man who had built Anheuser-Busch into a 50% market share colossus through sheer force of will and competitive ferocity, the man who more than any other single person alive understood what this company represented and what losing it would mean. He did not fight hard enough to save it. The precise reasons remain, to this day, a matter of painful speculation among people close to the family. Some believe August III had quietly concluded that his son's leadership had weakened the company to the point where a sale, at the right price, was the rational outcome. Others suggest that the relationship between father and son had deteriorated so completely that August III was, on some level, unable to fully commit to a defense that would have meant saving August IV's legacy. Whatever the truth, the man whose life's work was Anheuser-Busch did not deploy the full force of his formidable will against the takeover. InBev raised its bid to $70 per share, $52 billion total, the largest acquisition of a consumer goods company in the history of the world. On July 13, 2008, the Anheuser-Busch board of directors voted to accept. August IV was reported to have wept. The news broke across St. Louis like a physical blow. Workers at the brewery stood in clusters on the production floor, struggling to process what had happened. Longtime employees who had given 30 and 40 years to the company described feeling as though a death had occurred. Not a corporate transaction, but an actual death, the loss of something that had been alive and meaningful and irreplaceable. Local bars held impromptu wakes. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a front page that captured the city's grief in a single headline. In Leuven, Belgium, Carlos Brito held a press conference and spoke about synergies and global growth opportunities and the exciting future of the combined company. The words were technically accurate and entirely beside the point. What had actually happened was not a merger. It was the end of a dynasty. 151 years after Adolphus Busch stepped off a steamboat onto a St. Louis dock with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work, the empire he had built was gone, transferred, absorbed, rebranded as AB InBev and folded into a global corporate structure that had no particular attachment to Missouri, or to the Clydesdales, or to the idea that a beer company could be something more than a vehicle for generating returns. The king of American beer had been sold, and the family left behind was about to turn on itself with a ferocity that would shock even those who had watched them for years. There is a particular cruelty in the way that great losses unmask people. When the thing that held a family together, the shared purpose, the common enterprise, the dynasty that gave everyone inside it a reason to maintain appearances, is suddenly gone. What remains is not the family itself. What remains is everything the dynasty had been quietly containing. The resentments, the grievances, the wounds that had never been allowed to fully surface because the company always came first. For the Busch family, the sale of Anheuser-Busch removed the last structure holding everything together, and what followed was not grief processed quietly in private. It collapsed, public, painful, and compounding. Auguste Dufour did not recover from the sale. How could he? He had been CEO for less than 2 years when the company was taken. He had inherited an enterprise weakened by decades of family dysfunction, fought to defend it against the most well-funded hostile takeover in consumer goods history, and lost. The narrative that attached itself to him in the aftermath was brutal and reductive and not entirely unfair, that he had been the wrong man at the wrong moment, that the dynasty had ended on his watch, that the fourth generation had failed where the first 3 had succeeded. He retreated from public life almost immediately after the sale closed. The corporate role that had defined him, however imperfectly, was gone. The structure that had given his days shape and purpose had been dismantled. What filled the vacuum was the darkness that had always been present at the edges of his life, now moving to the center with nothing left to hold it back. The drinking intensified. The isolation deepened. People who had known him for years described a man who seemed to be disappearing into himself, withdrawing from relationships and responsibilities with an almost methodical completeness. Grant's farm, the 281-acre estate that had been the physical heart of the Busch dynasty for over a century, became the primary theater of his deterioration. He rattled around its enormous grounds largely alone, the Clydesdales grazing outside while inside the man responsible for their legacy came increasingly undone. Then, in December of 2010, tragedy arrived with a finality that silenced even those who had been harshest in their judgment of him. Adrienne Martin, a 30-year-old woman who had been in a relationship with Auguste Dufour, was found dead at his mansion on Grant's farm. The cause of death was determined to be an accidental drug overdose. She had twin daughters. She had driven to Grant's farm that evening and never driven home. The investigation that followed was, like everything involving the Busch name, complicated by the weight of wealth and legal resources. Authorities found prescription medications. They found evidence of a lifestyle operating far outside the boundaries of ordinary recklessness. They found a level of chaos inside that magnificent estate that stood in heartbreaking contrast to the ordered grandeur of its exterior. No charges were filed against Auguste Dufour, but the death of Adrienne Martin haunted him in ways that no legal outcome could address or resolve. Her family pursued civil action. The details that emerged through subsequent legal proceedings painted a portrait of a household in profound disorder. A man of immense inherited privilege living in conditions of profound personal ruin. Saint Avouf, Louis, which had always maintained a complicated loyalty to the Busch name even through its worst moments, grew quieter on the subject of Auguste Dufour. The city had absorbed the boardroom coup of 1975. It had absorbed the Arizona accident of 1983. It had absorbed the sale of 2008. Adrienne Martin's death was something different. Something that resisted the usual mechanisms of forgiveness and selective memory that wealth and a famous name typically provide. And while Auguste Dufour disappeared further into isolation, the broader family was fracturing along lines that had been forming for decades. The Busch estate, the trusts and properties and financial arrangements that represented what remained of Adolphus's original fortune after the sale proceeds had been distributed, became the subject of disputes that moved from family conversations into lawyers' offices with a speed that surprised even those who knew how fractured the relationships had become. Gussie's descendants, Auguste Dufour's half-siblings and cousins, the sprawling extended family that the old patriarch's multiple marriages had produced, were discovering that the removal of the company from the equation had not simplified the question of what the Busch name was worth. It had made that question infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous, because $15 billion, it turns out, is precisely the kind of number that transforms family grievances into wars. When Adolphus Busch built his empire, he built it with a particular vision of family in mind. The brewery would pass from generation to generation, intact and undivided, a single magnificent inheritance that would bind his descendants together the way the Rhine had bound the communities of his German childhood. He established trusts and structures designed to keep the fortune consolidated, to prevent the kind of dispersal and fragmentation that had destroyed other great American dynasties before him. He could not have anticipated what his family would eventually do with those structures. The legal war that erupted among the Busch heirs in the years following the InBev sale was not a single lawsuit or a clean dispute between two clearly defined parties. It was something far messier and far more revealing, a sprawling, multi-front conflict involving dozens of claimants, competing interpretations of trust documents written generations earlier, allegations of mismanagement and self-dealing, and the kind of intimate familial betrayals that only become possible when the people involved have known each other since childhood. At the center of it was the question of Gussie Busch's legacy. Gussie had been married multiple times and had fathered children across those marriages, a sprawling extended family whose relationships with each other ranged from complicated to openly hostile. The trusts he had established were substantial, designed to provide for his descendants across multiple generations. But the interpretation of those trusts, who was entitled to what, under which conditions, administered by whom, became the legal and financial battlefield on which the family's civil war was most nakedly fought. August 4th found himself entangled in disputes with half-siblings over the administration of family trusts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Allegations flew in both directions: that assets had been mismanaged, that distributions had been improperly handled, that certain family members had used their positions within the trust structures to benefit themselves at the expense of others. The specific legal claims shifted and evolved as proceedings progressed, but the underlying dynamic remained constant throughout. This was a family that had stopped trusting each other entirely. The disputes extended beyond trusts into physical property. Grant's farm itself, the 281-acre estate that Gussie had made the symbolic heart of the dynasty, where the Clydesdales had grazed for generations, and where Adolphus's vision of a permanent family seat had been most fully realized, became a point of profound contention. The costs of maintaining the property were immense. The question of who was responsible for those costs and who had the authority to make decisions about the estate's future became the subject of bitter legal argument. At various points, the future of Grant's farm appeared genuinely uncertain. The prospect of the estate being sold, subdivided, or fundamentally altered was not merely theoretical. It was a real possibility that the Busch family's most sacred physical inheritance might be broken apart by the same forces that had broken apart everything else. The Clydesdales, those magnificent animals that had made Americans weep at Super Bowl commercials for decades, that had been Gussie's gift to his father and his father's gift to the nation, were quietly sold off by AB InBev, which had no particular sentimental attachment to maintaining an expensive equine marketing tradition it had inherited along with the brewery. The herd that had symbolized the dynasty's warmth and permanence was dispersed. Some were purchased privately, some went to other owners. The image of those horses pulling a red and gold wagon through fresh snow, which had once felt as permanent as the American flag, became a memory. What the legal proceedings exposed, with the unsparing clarity that courtrooms impose on everything they touch, was the full architecture of a family's dysfunction. Depositions and filings revealed relationships corroded by decades of competition, resentment, and the particular toxicity that comes from growing up inside a legend you did not create and cannot escape. Children who had grown up together at Grant's farm now communicated exclusively through attorneys. Siblings who had once shared holidays in the mansion Adolphus built now argued over the financial statements of trusts their grandfather had established to protect them. The fortune that Adolphus had spent his life building, that Gussie had spent his life expanding, that August 3rd had spent his life defending, and that August 4th had lost in a single board vote, that fortune was now being consumed, dollar by dollar and year by year, by the legal machinery of a family at war with itself. Adolphus Busch had arrived in St. Louis in 1857 with almost nothing. He had built something extraordinary from that nothing, driven by the belief that what he created would outlast him and bind his family together across generations. He was half right. It outlasted him, but it did not bind them. It tore them apart. Epilogue: what remains? St. Louis still has Busch Stadium. The name is still there, carved into the exterior of the ballpark where Gussie's Cardinals won 3 World Series championships, where generations of Missouri families spent summer evenings eating peanuts and drinking beer and feeling the particular contentment of belonging to something larger than themselves. The name costs AB InBev a licensing fee to maintain. It is at this point a business arrangement, a transaction. But the letters are still there, and on warm July evenings when the stadium fills and the lights come on over the infield, it is still possible, for a moment, to feel the ghost of what the Busch name once meant in this city. Grant's farm is still there too. After years of uncertainty, of legal disputes and financial arguments and genuine fear among St. Louis preservationists that the estate might be lost entirely, the property was saved. AB InBev, which had owned Grant's farm as part of the acquisition, eventually transferred it back to the Busch family. Stiefel Financial, a St. Louis investment firm, partnered with the family to fund its restoration and continued operation as a public attraction. Visitors can still walk the grounds where Adolphus built his monument. They can still see the Bauernhof Gatehouse, still tour the property where Gussie kept his exotic animals and threw his legendary parties, still stand on the land that Ulysses Grant once farmed. The Clydesdales came back too. AB InBev, after considerable public pressure and no small amount of commercial calculation, restored the Clydesdale program. The horses still appear at the Super Bowl. They still canter down Main Street parade routes in cities across America. They are still magnificent, still capable of producing in audiences something that no amount of focus-grouped advertising can manufacture deliberately. But they belong to a Belgian-Brazilian corporation now, and everyone knows it. August Anheuser-Busch III is gone. He died in September of 2019 at the age of 84, in the city he had dominated for half a century. The obituaries were long and largely respectful, cataloging the market share numbers and the revenue growth and the Bud Light triumph over Miller Lite. They mentioned the boardroom coup of 1975 carefully, obliquely, as though it were a complicated footnote rather than the defining moral act of his professional life. He was remembered accurately as one of the most effective executives in the history of the American consumer goods industry. He was remembered, less explicitly but just as accurately, as a man who had confused power with love and paid for that confusion in the currency of broken relationships. August Anheuser-Busch IV is still alive. He is in his early 60s now, living a life that has retreated almost entirely from public view. The charisma that once made rooms rearrange themselves around him, the magnetism inherited from a grandfather he resembled far more than he resembled his father, has been largely invisible for years. He has given almost no interviews. He has made almost no public appearances. The man who was supposed to be the continuation of a dynasty that stretched back to 1857 exists now at the edges of the story rather than its center, which is perhaps both the saddest and the most merciful outcome available to him. Adolphus Busch is buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. His mausoleum is one of the grandest in a cemetery full of grand mausoleums, a fitting monument for a man who built a brewing empire from an immigrant's ambition and a riverfront city's thirst. Visitors still come to see it. They stand in front of the stone and read the name and try to connect the man buried inside to the red and gold wagons and the magnificent horses and the cold bottle of Budweiser waiting in 100 million American refrigerators. The connection is still there, faint now and complicated and carrying the weight of everything that came after, but still there. This is what remains when a dynasty destroys itself from within. Not nothing, never quite nothing. The product survives, the name survives, the horses survive, the stadium survives. But the family, the actual human family, the thing Adolphus really built when he built his empire, the thing that was always supposed to matter more than the beer, that is gone, dispersed, litigated away, consumed by the very fortune it was meant to share. Adolphus Busch arrived in America with nothing and built everything. His heirs had everything. And, one betrayal at a time, they built nothing.